Hello, everybody. Very warm welcome to you this evening for another fascinating webinar with Seth Frantzman. Can Israel's growing relationships in the Middle East and Africa counter extremist Muslim ideology? We're just going to wait for a couple more minutes for a few more people to join, and we'll be starting shortly. Make yourselves comfortable, and thanks for being here. Hi, everybody. Welcome. You are most welcome to this evening's webinar with Seth Frantzman. We are just going to wait a couple of minutes for some people to join. It's only 2 minutes past 7:30, so I think we can give them another minute or two, and then we're going to start. Thanks for being here again. Hi, everybody. Welcome. You are most welcome to this evening's webinar with Seth Frantzman. We are just going to wait a couple of minutes for some people to join. It's only 2 minutes past 7:30, so I think we can give them another minute or two, and then we're going to start. Thanks for being here again. Hi, everybody. Welcome. You are most welcome to this evening's webinar with Seth Frantzman. We are just going to wait a couple of minutes for some people to join. It's only 2 minutes past 7:30, so I think we can. All right. Give them another minute I think we can all start. If everybody is comfortable, it is my great pleasure to introduce Ben Levitas, the member of the South African Zionist Federation Cape Council, MANCOM, and member of the Media Committee, to introduce Seth, but I've just made a scene on my notes. I do have to think we can all start. If everybody is comfortable, it is my great pleasure to hi everybody, welcome. We're about to start now. Thanks for being here. Before we get going for this fascinating webinar with Seth Frantzman on can Israel's growing relationship in the Middle East and Africa counter extremist Muslim ideology. We do want to give a sincere vote of thanks to the World Zionist Organization who have partnered with us in this webinar. Hi everybody, and we'd also like to welcome members of the local media. Before we get going for this fascinating webinar, Seth Frantzman can Israel's growing relationship in the Middle East and Africa counter extremist Muslim ideology. We do want to give a sincere vote of thanks to the World Zionist Organization who have partnered with us in this webinar. Hi everybody, and we'd also like to welcome members of the local media. Before we get going for this fascinating.
Okay, can I do the introduction?
Sorry about that, guys. Can you hear me now? Did that fix the echo problem, or is it?
Yeah. There was a terrible echo.
I'm so sorry. That's my mistake. You know, as much as we try and keep things correct, you know, these technical errors slip in. So I'm terribly sorry about that. Are we all good now? Everybody can hear me fine. Just give me a thumbs up if you can. Thanks. My apologies. I do beg your pardon.
Okay. Can I start?
Ben, you can, but I do have to quickly give 2 votes of thanks. So let me just start again. So thank you all for being here. We would like to give a vote of thanks to the World Zionist Organization who have partnered with us in this webinar. We thank them for their support, and we'd also like to welcome members of the local media who have joined us for this webinar. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Ben Levitas, member of the South African Zionist Federation Cape Council, MANCOM, and member of the Media Committee. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave. So it gives me pleasure on behalf of the Cape Council Zionist Federation to introduce our speaker and to welcome all our listeners, our regular listeners that have been taking part in this fascinating series of webinars, which tonight is going to be addressed by Seth Frantzman. Seth is a graduate of the Hebrew University where he obtained a doctorate in 2010. He has been lecturing at the IDC and at the Al-Quds University in Jerusalem. He is a journalist extraordinaire, has traveled very widely, was one of the first journalists to visit Sinjar in Iraq, has probably done half a dozen trips with the Kurds in Iraq. I would say he's an authority on Iraq. At the moment, he's an authority on the Kurds. At the moment, he's covering the Armenian and the Azerbaijani conflict. He has written a book called ISIS, which deals with, or After ISIS in the Middle East, which deals with the conflict between Iran and America. I've been muted. Yeah. Okay. I'm not quite sure where I was, but there's probably no journalist with more hands-on experience and first-hand experience than Seth, who can talk to us on tonight's topic, which is basically about Israel's growing influence in the Middle East and whether that would mitigate Muslim extremism. So it is my pleasure to hand the microphone over to Seth.
Unmute, Seth, you muted.
I'm now unmuted, so good. Really great. Thank you so much for having me today. We have two subjects, I think, that are of interest, and they are related, but they are also a bit different. Now, one of them I will address first, which is the growing relationships of Israel in the Middle East. And that I think all of us have heard recently. Israel looks like it will normalize relations with the UAE and also Bahrain, which are two small Gulf states. One of them quite powerful and influential, and Bahrain is a smaller state which is very closely aligned with Saudi Arabia, and these countries are themselves close allies. And the other, I think, issue we will look at a little bit is then not only the fact that I covered ISIS and the war on ISIS for many years, but what might be coming next in terms of the next wave of extremism and what might be coming in terms of ISIS or groups like it that are perhaps closer to your neighborhood in Southern Africa. So let me start by giving a sense of what is happening in Israel. And obviously, if anyone wants to stop me at some point, or if there's some issue, please feel free to raise that. Israel, since its independence in 1948, has always struggled to have relations with many countries in the world. And that is something that is not normal. And most countries at independence tend to be recognized by other countries, and the only struggle they have is perhaps financially trying to open enough embassies, but they usually accept as de facto that they will have recognition. Israel has faced the same hurdles as some other countries, like for instance, Kosovo, in terms of trying to just get recognition abroad. And that, of course, has to relate to the way it was born as a Jewish state at war with its neighbors. I think it also has to do a lot with how the colonial powers walked away from the Middle East and kind of just threw everything to the flames and said, well, sort it out. And so therefore, of course, instead of it all being sorted out, they left behind a bit of a disaster. And so Israel has had a lot of struggles to get this recognition. And most of the struggles it had was not recognition worldwide, but it was primarily issues relating to most Muslim and Arab countries. And then slightly further abroad, because of the issues of the global South and the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, it had many hurdles at certain periods of time because of the 67 and 73 war, with some relations that it had and then lost in Africa. And in other countries, it also had some troubles, for instance, with Iran, where Israel once had relatively decent relations and now has basically no relations, and Iran is a very hostile country to Israel. Israel has had the same problems with Turkey, which is that Turkey and Israel used to be very, very close allies. And today, Turkey has relations with Israel, but they're extremely bad and extremely cold relations. They are bordering on almost not being relations. So that's a fact of life for Israel. I think Israel basically accepted that fact for most of its existence, up until suddenly there began to be hints of peace. And that began with Egypt and then Jordan. And then very quickly in the 1990s, if people remember, especially with the Oslo Accords and the push for a two-state solution, we started to see that basically most countries in the region were willing to consider relations with Israel. That includes most of North Africa and the Gulf states. Israel had several hostile states close to it, which were states that spent most of their time bashing Israel as a kind of performance art, which is, I would say, for instance, Syria. Syrian regime was very hostile to Israel, but the Syrian regime had already admitted in secret memos back in the 1970s that it could never fight a war and win against Israel, and that it would have to accept the fact that Israel's in the region. So this was a bit of performance, and I think that when we fast forward, eventually we realized that many countries, especially Saudi Arabia and the countries that it is close to, had decided that it was worthwhile to have peace with Israel, but it had to be some sort of concession from Israel's side. And that's a very interesting paradigm, because most other countries in the world, you don't hear this logic of, well, we can't have relations with India unless India will leave Kashmir, or vice versa. Pakistan will leave Kashmir. So it's accepted. Of course, Pakistan and India will have relations. Of course, fine, okay, there is some dispute, but there will be relations. Turkey obviously still has relations with countries like Greece, even if they have some dispute over places like Cyprus. Even Cyprus obviously is its own country, but Turkey occupies northern Cyprus. So primarily with Israel, there was a concept of a give and take. Somehow there should be a give and a take. And I think eventually, in this last American administration, decided that it would basically rewrite, say, 20 years or so or more of that paradigm. And what that means is that this paradigm of this kind of Oslo Accords, which was signed in the mid-1990s, would kind of go away in some ways, at least the concept that Israel would have to withdraw and that Israel would have to make a full peace with the Palestinians, and that was the only avenue to get relations with the rest of the countries in the Middle East. And so we saw, for instance, in the last few years, a sudden willingness of many of the countries in the Gulf to have relations with Israel. And I think there's a lot of questions about what made that happen. And I think the reality is that many of those countries wanted relationships with Israel, and Israel wanted relationships with them. The Gulf states, for instance, the UAE or Qatar or Bahrain, to a lesser extent, Kuwait. Those states are what? Their economies are primarily based on oil, or they are based on globalization and tourism and expats and trade. But those countries don't produce that much locally. And it seems to me that if you look at Israel's economy, Israel is a very dynamic country. It produces a lot of things indigenously. But if you look at the economy of a place like Tel Aviv, it's primarily a coastal city, and it's plugged in closely to this kind of globalized economy. So therefore, I think the idea that Israel and the Gulf states would find a kind of harmony through economics and trade made a lot of sense. It also made sense for other reasons. In the last several years, there was a crisis in the Gulf between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And without getting into all of the complications of that crisis, suffice it to say that Qatar is a relatively small country, but it had very interesting pretensions of playing a much larger role in the Middle East. And part of that role, it wanted to have a slightly larger religious role, which means it wanted to fund groups usually linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. And it happened to be that the same government in Turkey, the AKP party, which came to power in the early 2000s, was closely aligned ideologically and religiously with Qatar's worldview. And those countries were not aligned with the worldview that was changing and shaping in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Bahrain. And I think it's very hard to characterize exactly what the worldview of Saudi Arabia is today, but it is important to note that it has moved very far from the 1990s, when Saudi Arabia was accused of supporting extremism or funding extremist or far-right or conservative ideologies, and that it and the UAE especially have sought to fund a lot more in terms of religious tolerance, to the extent that the UAE hosts religious leaders, rabbis, Catholic priests, all of the trappings of the idea of having this kind of globalized, multicultural narrative. Now you could say, well, wait, but isn't Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they're authoritarian countries? Maybe that's just window dressing. Maybe it is. But the point is that officially, their view was that they wanted to get away from the era of the 1990s and 80s, when they were accused of basically supporting extremist groups, or they openly supported them, for instance, with the funding for the Mujahideen that were fighting the Soviets. And they wanted to become much closer to the United States, and they wanted to also confront what they saw as a kind of Turkish-Qatari challenge, and also an Iranian challenge. Iran is just across the Gulf from the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And if you recall, during the Obama administration, the United States had begun to sign, not only had begun to sign a deal, did sign a deal with the Iranians, but had begun to shift US foreign policy away from Saudi Arabia and seek to kind of redress historic American foreign policy in the region. And I think if you look at the trend in US policy, they wanted to move away from the American kind of global hegemony of the 1990s, in which George H.W. Bush had promised a kind of new world order where America will control everything. And if you listen to the speeches of Obama and then, of course, Trump, you will find a lot more criticism and reticence to use American power abroad. And that, of course, is a reaction to the fact that you had many years of the Bush administration invading countries like Iraq, and most of that became, at least from Washington's point of view, mostly a failure and a disaster. So there was a shift in the region. American power was weakening. Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Bahrain found themselves a bit alone, and also confronting two very powerful countries, Turkey and Iran. And if you look around the Middle East and you say to yourself, I don't get along with Turkey, I don't get along with Iran, who else is in the Middle East? Well, there's Egypt. Egypt was once a very powerful country militarily in the 1960s. But today, as you know, Egypt has had a change of power in 2013. It spends most of its time on domestic policy and fighting an insurgency against ISIS in Sinai. Egypt does not project power like the old days. There's one country in the region, though, that does project a lot of power, and that's Israel. Israel has fifth generation F-35 stealth fighter jets. Israel has openly claimed that it has carried out more than 1,000 airstrikes on Iranian targets in Syria. So if you look around the region and you say, well, there's one country here that we can work very closely with, but we have a problem. The official policy of the Arab League and Saudi Arabia is that we cannot do peace with Israel unless we get something back, which is a Palestinian state. And the Palestinians themselves are divided between Ramallah and the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is very close to Turkey. Hamas itself is rooted in the Muslim Brotherhood. That's not a conspiracy, it's just a fact of life. Hamas says that that's what it's rooted in. So you all of a sudden have a Palestinian polity that is also divided. You have a Gulf relationship that is divided. So the whole region, you could say, is divided between Iran on one side, Turkey a bit, and then, of course, Hamas and groups that are connected to them. Iran openly funds Hamas. Iran, for instance, has trafficked missile technology to Hamas. And who else does Iran support? Obviously, Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is just a fact. So you have a region that is very, very divided. Everywhere you look, Saudi Arabia, for instance, in Lebanon, Saudi Arabia is working with Saad Hariri, the Sunni former prime minister, and Hezbollah is supported by Iran. So all across the region, you have these proxy conflicts. And all of a sudden, the countries in the Gulf, I think, realize that they can work with Israel and they want to get something out of it. And they're not going to get a Palestinian peace deal because Israel is not going to withdraw from the West Bank. And not only is it not going to withdraw from the West Bank, but even if Israel wanted to withdraw, it doesn't have a partner because it has a divided Palestinian polity. So maybe the Gulf states can get something from America. And that's where the Donald Trump administration comes in. Whether or not one agrees with Trump, the fact is that the Trump administration was willing to throw away decades of US foreign policy concepts and say, listen, let's just start anew. We'll just look at this like a deal. We'll find a way to do a deal. And that's what Trump told them. And that's what, when Trump went there, for instance, to the Gulf in 2017, he had this big meeting with the Egyptian leader, the Saudi leader, and a bunch of Arab and Muslim leaders, and basically said, listen, there's a new American way of doing policy. This isn't humanitarian intervention. This isn't going to be about democracy. This isn't the old style America. This is an America that's more transactional. Give us, you get something, we'll give you something. And the Gulf states want something. They want American support and they want American military weapons. So I think very quickly you saw a pragmatic approach, which was the Gulf states want to work with Israel. All they need to get past is the fact that they promised for years that they're not going to do a deal unless they get something. And all of a sudden, they have a lot of incentive to get something, and they have a lot of powerful enemies, and powerful enemies make other people become friends. So if you look at the quick timeline, I just go back into it. In October of 2018, Benjamin Netanyahu flew secretly to Oman. And then, of course, he told people about his visit. Netanyahu likes to boast a bit about the fact that he has kind of recreated the Middle East. I mean, whether or not that's true is debatable, but Netanyahu is very clear on having his own theory, which is he says, you know, only the strong will survive and you have to be strong. And if you are strong, you'll get peace. That's what he says. And he kind of has a view that if you say it long enough, it will come true. And if you say it, you kind of believe it, it will happen. And so he sort of seemed to have made it happen. He flew to Oman. Then Israeli ministers very quickly went to the UAE, and those were unprecedented visits. Oman, by the way, is a country that no one ever seems to really think about or care about. But Oman is an important country because it's very closely linked to Iran. So Oman is interesting because it's a kind of neutral country. At least it presents itself as neutral. And Oman said, yeah, listen, you know, Israel's effective life in the region, and we should accept it. And that was a big statement. And that's what Oman told the region. And very soon afterward, you saw a lot of movement in terms of Bahrain hosting Trump's famous economic peace kind of conference, which didn't really produce anything, but it was important that the Bahrainis hosted it in June 2019 because it showed that Bahrain was on board with this kind of Trump transactional concept of diplomacy. And very quickly afterward, in January of 2020, after Israel had had 3 elections in 1 year, the Trump administration rolled out a peace deal. Now, it's important to consider the fact that Israel was having 3 elections because Benjamin Netanyahu cannot create a majority coalition. And so the American administration had to wait a whole year to roll out the peace plan. That set back the Trump timetable, and it made all the Bahrainis and UAE people wait a bit to do what they wanted to do anyway, which was to announce this peace agreement. So we see then, for instance, in February of this year, Netanyahu flies secretly to to Uganda, where he holds a secret meeting with the Sudanese. Sudan is a country that was an enemy state of Israel. Actually, it's Sudan that hosted the Khartoum famous conference of 3 no's, no peace, no recognition. So we see all of a sudden that Netanyahu is meeting with the Sudanese leader. Now, it's made possible by the fact that Sudan has had a kind of internal revolution. So the pro-Muslim Brotherhood leadership there has left, and there's a new regime. And so Netanyahu is able to test the waters. He also tests the waters with Chad. And then very quickly afterward, you see that the UAE relations seem to be coming online. I think the COVID disaster pandemic helped to accelerate this a bit. There were 2 aid flights earlier this year to Israel from the UAE, the first flights ever in history, at least first flights officially in history. And very soon after, the UAE ambassador in Washington wrote an op-ed in an Israeli newspaper, and you start to see a lot more Jewish figures writing also opinion pieces in Gulf newspapers. And this is very much symbolic for the Gulf. And then you have the announcement on July 6th of this year that the 2 largest Israeli defense companies, IAI and Rafael, will be working to deal with the COVID disaster with a Group 42, which is a company in the UAE. And that's interesting because you have 3 companies working together and the countries didn't even have relations. So it was clear at that time that the kind of train to the relations had left the station. And very soon afterward, then you had the announcement in August that there will be relations and normalization. And then you had a whole series of deals come together. The Trump administration also basically announced that Israel recognized Kosovo. It's interesting that the Kosovo deal was presented in a false way. Kosovo and Israel didn't have relations. It wasn't because Kosovo, which is a primarily Muslim country, didn't want to recognize Israel. Kosovo wanted relations with Israel. It was that Israel is close to Serbia and didn't want to recognize Kosovo. But the Trump administration dangled enough in front of the countries and they decided that they were all normalized. Israel already had relations with Serbia, but the question was what happened with Kosovo and whether they will move the embassies to Jerusalem. And then, of course, you have the Bahrainis also announced that they will have relations. And then there is the signing of the accords on just 2 weeks ago. So very, very recently. And so all of a sudden, it looks like Israel has kind of turned a huge page. I mean, this is an unprecedented series of relationships, despite the fact that they've been dismissed as, well, it's the Trump administration, it's bad, or, well, the countries in the Gulf are authoritarian. I never understood the logic that said, well, because they're authoritarian, therefore it's not important that they have relations. I mean, obviously, relations are important unto themselves, and they should be taken for granted. So it seems odd that there were no relations in the past. And now I think we will just ask ourselves in 10 years, how could it be that there were not relations? I think then there is a question as to other issues, are these countries, will this increase human rights violations or something? Yeah, the relations are not grounded in human rights. And that's a fact. And there's most relations in the world today, whether it's Pakistan or China or wherever you like. Most countries have relations and they're not usually grounded in human rights. So this relationship with Israel and the Gulf is not grounded in democracy or human rights. There's no connection. That's the reality. And the question then is, okay, well, what about will the relationship mean that there is not going to be a Palestinian state? Or does that kind of mean that Israel has escaped any responsibility for creating that? And that's a good question. I think that it is clear that from Netanyahu's point of view, if you can get relations with all these countries, do you ever need to change the peace kind of concept? It may be that these countries, once they have relations with Israel, will have more influence or more leverage over Israel to push peace than they did before. Because how can you push a peace agreement if you don't even have relations with someone? I mean, it doesn't really make sense. If you have relations with them, then at least you can still begin to push some sort of peace agreement. And I think that there's no reason to believe that peace is further or closer today than a year ago. I mean, it's true, the fact of any sort of peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians that would turn into a Palestinian state is not closer today than last year. But it's not that the relations with the Gulf made it less close. Just the reality on the ground is that the idea of creating a Palestinian state on the parameters of the 1990s is very, very unlikely, considering the fact that there is something like several 100,000 Israelis that live in the West Bank, and the whole nature of the way the West Bank looks in terms of all these different communities. The chances that there can be kind of easily cut, well, we'll just take this part and put it over here, I think the chances of that are relatively slim. So whether the peace deals have made that less possible, I would say no. I would say that definitely what's happened with the UAE and Bahrain is this could be a much warmer peace than Israel enjoyed with other countries. Israel has relations with Jordan and Turkey and Egypt. Israel's relations with all of those countries are not a warm people-to-people relationship. And I know for a fact that in the last few weeks, there have been a lot of Zoom meetings and there's a lot of excitement between some Israelis and some of the people in the Gulf about the possibility of kind of human-to-human, personal, civil society relationship. So I think that that's a real difference. Now you could say, well, yeah, but the UAE is not a very large country. Yes, it's not a very big country, but lots of countries are not very big. Belgium is not a very big country. Doesn't mean we could just write it off and say, well, let's just get rid of Belgium. I mean, lots of countries have just several million people. The UAE is a very important country globally, despite having not very many people. And I think that Qatar is the same. They are very important countries in the Middle East. It would be a mistake to pretend that they are not. The historic Middle East, which is Syria, Iraq, and Cairo, Egypt, Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo. That's the historic Arabic heartland of the Middle East. Those countries today, they are of course very big countries and they are historic capitals, but they do not have the importance in terms of culture and production of movies and all sorts of things that they once did. And that's just part of the reasons, because Syria has fought a 9 or 8 year civil war and the country has been largely destroyed. And it's also had a reactionary regime in charge for, I think, 40 years or something, one family rule, which is not great for a country in terms of cultural production, probably. And Iraq is a divided society. It's a country that is has large numbers of Iranian-backed militias. It has a Kurdistan region. It's a very divided country. It's much poorer than it was in 1980. It's a really, I've been there many times. Iraq is a country that is really barely hanging on. It's not what it was, and it's hard to, when you travel around Iraq, it's hard to think of it as one country. It feels like a country that is extremely divided, and the people there, you have people down in the southern Iraq who seem, many of them, to feel much closer to Iranian Ayatollahs or Shiite religious faith than they do close necessarily in terms of some sort of Iraqi nationalism. You have people in the Kurdistan region that you could stay in the Kurdistan region for a very long time and you would never see an Iraqi flag. It's not normal to have a country where 15% of the people never fly the national flag. So that's I think that makes Iraq a very divided country. And therefore, what the point I was trying to make is that the Gulf states, even if they appear small, today they have a lot of role in terms of religious, cultural export. And that's because the heartland of the Middle East has been partly destroyed and badly injured. And that will allow me to segment into the second part of what I should discuss, I think, which is the small book that I wrote about this after ISIS, which I hope that people will check out. It's a book that is I wrote basically over the last several years, and it was published late last year, so it's still very current. The book basically looks at the war against Islamic State or ISIS. This book is a bit different than some of the other books out there. This is not a book that is really about ISIS. It's a book that is about the people that suffered under ISIS occupation. And it's hard for me to make a size comparison with South Africa. I usually lecture to American audiences. So I will say that, well, ISIS controlled an area the size of New Jersey or something. And people say, well, okay, I understand that. It's like this. I could not begin to compare what ISIS controlled to a region in South Africa, but I would assume that if we were to do it, it would be some huge swath of South Africa. but it would be difficult for me to draw a direct size comparison. Anyway, let's just say a large area. So what that means is you have basically a state that was created by Islamic State, it called itself a state, in 2013, 2014. And how did ISIS create a state? ISIS was an extremist organization with roots in Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. We could say Sunni jihadist groups, if you'd like, i.e. they're not Shiites. But they have roots in that kind of ideology. But I think ISIS was, if you wanted to compare ISIS to jihadism or extremism, ISIS is to Al-Qaeda what Nazism is to Italian fascism. ISIS basically took fascism, extremism, and put it on steroids. And what it did was, when ISIS was as a group of basically insurgents and fighters, they had been able to capture a lot of weapons and machinery from the Syrian regime, and they were able to then invade the second largest city in Iraq, which is called Mosul, in northern Iraq. And when they took over Mosul, Mosul is a city of more than almost 2 million people, I think. They took that city, it took them about 1 day. 1 day. But you know how long it took to take back Mosul from ISIS, to get an idea of how big the city is. And I served I was there in the fighting for Mosul, which was kind of block to block, street to street, like Stalingrad. It took, I think, something like 9 months to take back the city that ISIS conquered in 1 day. They conquered it in a day because the city's population was very much hostile to Baghdad and the at that time Shiite-led government of Nouri al-Maliki. And so ISIS rolled in with these black flags that everyone is famous to see them. And the people there flocked and said, yeah, our liberators are here, it's great. And very quickly, ISIS began to do things that were not very great. They began to expel all the Christians and they declared a caliphate. And within several months, they had then launched an invasion of an area called Sinjar that is populated by a religious minority group that is called Yazidis. The Yazidis are a local kind of indigenous group with very secretive religious practices, but they are a group that ISIS and the extremists saw as quote unquote devil worshippers or infidels, whatever term you would like to call them. And ISIS decided to commit a genocide that in my view is very similar to what the Nazis did. They basically saw these people as subhuman and they began to slaughter them. They slaughtered them much like the Einsatz group did in Eastern Europe. They took them out to the desert. They made the men dig the graves, or they dug them for them, and they machine gunned them. And then they took bulldozers and they put dirt on top of the bodies. And they took the elderly women and shot them, blindfolded them and shot them. And they took the children and the younger women and they sold them into slavery. And I was there. I went to Sinjar when it was liberated by Kurdish forces in 2015. And we saw the mass graves, and you can see the skulls of the people and the blindfolds and the pieces and the hair and all of the what the remains were. And in many cases, the bodies had not been covered well. So dogs and animals had picked at them, and you could see just, you could see the remains. And that genocide, which killed several thousand people in just several days, which the numbers you'd say, well, that's not as many as Auschwitz, obviously, it's not 1 million. It's true. The number of people that ISIS killed was similar to maybe what would have happened at Auschwitz in a day or two. So in terms of the volume of killing was similar, but it only lasted a few days. Most of the Yazidis, several 100,000 of them were able to flee, and they were aided by Kurdish forces who helped to rescue them very heroically. And they were also aided a bit by American bombs and American aid that began to flow in August 2014. And so that's how ISIS began its existence, I think, on the global playing field. It executed a bunch of journalists as well, including a journalist who used to work with several friends of mine named Steven Sotloff. They cut his head off. But very quickly, I think the international community understood this organization is a devil-like, Nazi-like organization. And if you want to fight groups like this, you have to do what was done to the Nazis, which is totally destroy them. And so 70 countries signed on to fight ISIS and destroy this organization. Most of the countries did not contribute much, but the Americans did, and the British and the French and several other Eastern European countries. And they began to train the Kurds. They trained 200,000 Iraqis, or trained and mentored them. And they also trained 80,000 people in Syria of a group called the SDF, or Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a partly Kurdish, Christian, Arab group. I'm not going to get into all the politics of it. The SDF is a far left group. It's connected, the Turks claim it's connected to the PKK. It's not my business. The fact is the SDF defeated ISIS in Raqqa. Sometimes when you're fighting people like Nazis, you need people like the Soviets to do it. So it's not always a clean thing. In Iraq, it also was not clean. The people fighting ISIS, many of them were Shiite militiamen who were basically fans of the Ayatollah Khamenei. I rode on several of their tanks. They were flying the Shiite flags, usually with a picture of a sword dripping in blood. And they said, you know, we're coming, we're coming. This is revenge for Karbala. This is revenge for the Imam Hussein. They viewed the war as a totally religious war in which there can be not much mercy given. And from what I understand, not much mercy was given to many of the ISIS fighters that they came across. In the Battle of Mosul, it was not like that. It was not so barbaric. I think the Battle of Mosul lasted 9 months because the Americans played a close role of close air support, and the Iraqi army, which is not as sectarian as the militias, went street by street and cleaned them out, these 5,000 ISIS fighters. Many of the ISIS fighters, by the way, I think 50,000 of them, were not from Iraq and Syria. Actually, the number of people in a place like Mosul of 2 million or 1.5 million, the number of Sunni Arabs who joined ISIS was less than 1%. So you say to yourself, well, wait a sec, but I thought they all cheered. Well, they did cheer, but a lot of them didn't want to fight. Who were the fighters of ISIS? They were 50,000 people from all over the world, probably some from South Africa as well. They came from the Caribbean, they came from China, they came from Bangladesh, they came from Chechnya. There were so many Chechens that joined ISIS that when we found houses that were liberated, we would find sometimes in Cyrillic and Chechen writing. There were guys speaking French, they speaking British or English, obviously. This is a huge gaggle of people that joined this organization. And they joined, many of them, because they thought it's a caliphate. Some of them joined from Europe, 5,000 people, because they thought that they would get slaves. And they were told, you can come to Syria and have a villa and we'll give you slaves. Many of the people that joined were cruel. Many of the women that were Yazidis that were sold into slavery, they said that the most cruelty they suffered was from the hands of the foreigners. So this was a dehumanizing ideology. It took several years to defeat. And when it was defeated, unlike the Nazis, it didn't just kind of disappear. It was defeated, but the people that joined it, especially the locals, they just faded back into the hills and the caves. And I was there last year in northern Iraq, and we went up to a mountain with the Kurdish fighters, and there was an area where there was a mountain that's controlled by the Kurds, and there's a kind of valley next to it. On the other side, there's an Iraqi-controlled area. And the Kurds and the Iraqis are all part of the same country. They're supposed to work together, but they don't work very well together. So there's a kind of section in between the two front lines. And inside that section, there was some caves. So I sitting there with these Kurdish guys, and the colonel says, look, quickly. And we put the binoculars on, and we saw down in the ravine a little black speck run out and get some water and run back into this cave. And he said, look, that's ISIS. And I said, really? That's ISIS? He said, yeah, that's what it is. So the guys that once terrorized the whole world and were slaughtering people in Paris and the black flags and all this, it had been reduced to a few guys in a cave. But actually, if you add up the number of caves and the number of guys, it's still 10,000 people. They're just hiding out and waiting. And then I guess I will just quickly transition to discuss the problems that have affected then the rest of the world in terms of this organization. When I covered ISIS, I went to Turkey, I went to Senegal, I went to Egypt, I went to the Gulf. I went all over the Middle East to find out how people are fighting this organization. And, you know, one of the things that I saw when I was in Senegal and Egypt is that these groups have begun to consume a huge swath of Africa in mostly what is called the Sahel, from all the way in Somalia all the way over towards Senegal. And they are kind of consuming these areas that are between these countries, these so-called ungoverned areas or instability areas. And it's unsurprising, I suppose, that they will eventually consume their way all the way down to a place like Mozambique, and that they will operate in the same way. They wait until the government is weak. They radicalize people. And, you know, it's a draw, you know, the idea that radicalization is some complicated myth, some sort of like, oh, it's really complicated. I don't think radicalization is that complicated. I don't think radicalization of ISIS is any different than someone who decided to join a hooligan football group, or someone that joined the Nazis or the communists or any type of extremist group. And of course, you can have lots of people that join the Communist Party who are not extremists. What I'm talking about is the people that joined Comrade Stalin and slaughtered people in the gulags. I'm talking about the bad part of things. So not every group that is a Salafi or even an extremist group, by the way, becomes a terrorist group. There's all sorts of people who are extremely religious, not interested in terrorism. And in fact, I would say that in most cases, as I saw in Mosul, you're talking about 1%. But the 1% can be quite dangerous if they're willing to kill themselves in a fight. So I think what we see now in some places is that if a group comes and it offers you guns and it offers you slaves and women and it offers you a villa somewhere, lots of people will join. And I don't think that that's different than any example throughout history. I don't think that these types of groups like ISIS, I don't think it's worth it to spend a lot of time dwelling on the ideology. I think that's as ridiculous as spending a lot of time trying to read Karl Marx to understand why the gulags were built. I don't think there's any connection. The famine in Ukraine was not written in Das Kapital. And you could say that, yes, what ISIS did to the Yazidis was because they believed that that was a religious commandment. I agree. Just like the Nazis believe that their hocus pocus nonsense means that, you know, I'm Jewish, so I'm subhuman or something. But it's a hocus pocus, scientific nonsense. So ISIS, I think ISIS in general, it's wrong to look at it as a deep ideology. It's a very shallow surface one. And what it does is it promises people, especially young men, the ability to do all the amoral, evil things that they would like to do anyway. And it says, listen, you can come do it. Here we are. And I think that that's what I saw. And look, there's a lot of people out there. I mean, if you want to talk about the subject of this talk was about extremist Muslims or Islam or something. I mean, look, to be honest, you know who defeated ISIS? It was not Europeans. It was Muslims that defeated ISIS. I mean, every Kurdish fighter who I slept next to them in the barracks and on the front lines who protected my life, all of them were Muslims. So the fighters I was with used to pray at night and fight ISIS during the day. So I would say that the reality of a group like ISIS is, yes, it does appeal to extremist young men. I would also argue that the Middle East, where many extremists used to come from, is not an area that produces extremists today. I think most countries in the Middle East, like Jordan and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are not funding extremism. I think extremism is growing in the periphery, and that's precisely why closer to you, there is more of a problem with that, because you have people gravitating towards that, looking for answers. And that will bring this discussion full circle, because where we started with this was the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the Bahrain have moved away from the policies of the 90s, and they have made peace with Israel. And that's precisely why we are not seeing as much financial support for extremism in the region, because those countries have realized that actually stability is much more important, and tolerance and coexistence, even if it sometimes comes with an authoritarian flag and a monarchy and things like that, but that's what they believe. And I think that's why the Middle East is very different today. And I think the Sahel and Philippines and all sorts of other places, and even Europe, have real problems with extremism, and they better start to figure out how to fight it, because it's not an easy devil to get by the tail. So I'll end there, and you guys can do your whatever else comes next in this question answer, whatever you like.
Well, thank you so much, Seth. I think that was, I'm speaking for everybody when I say that was really fascinating. and riveting, and what a great speaker. We encourage you all to please post your questions in the chat. We will be coming to those in just a moment. While you have a think and post the questions in the chat, we're going to share a short video about some of the work the South African Friends of Israel is doing in South Africa.
I am Pastor Tsepo Musala from the church called the Kingdom of God Ministries. We are at Dreamland. It is a community. They are having people which are less privileged. Clive, he came to our churches and then he explained to us about SAFI, South African Friends of Israel, and told us that SAFI can be able to help us because we have been knocking doors in and out. So I was suffering a lot because sometimes I will have to dish this soup for these kids I'm using from my own pocket, and it was really, really stretchy. So Mr. Clive, through the help of SAFI, came at the right time. He was an angel sent. So when the pandemic started, we were able to give out 5,000 sandwiches and more than 200 food parcels. And we also gave clothes. And we came back again even today through the help of SAFI to dish out soup. God said in his book that he said to Israel, I'll bless those who bless you. And all these nations, they will be blessed through Israel. The nation of Israel, it is actually the mother body of Christianity. Here I'm having over 200 kids. I was also a street kid. I experienced that life. So my wish, it is to see in our community that we are putting people first. If only we can put people first, then we can change this nation.
Thank you so much for that. If you're in a position to, please make any donation you can to the South African Friends of Israel Coronavirus Appeal Fund. No amount is too big or small. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Galia Tregenza Hall, the media liaison for the South African Zionist Federation Cape Council, to moderate the Q&A. Over to you, Galia.
Thanks, David. And Seth, I must just, before we start, I must just thank you for that very thorough and that very clear, very concise overview that you've given us. So much knowledge there. You've been on the ground in these places, first-hand experiences, and I'm sure we can all agree we've learned so much just from listening to you tonight. So thank you. And thank you as well to those of you who have already been posting questions in the chat. This Q&A session is an opportunity for us to learn even more and to engage with Seth on these very relevant and these very topical, very important themes. So thank you for those of you who have posted, and I'd encourage more of you to continue posting your questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So I would like to start with the first question, Seth, which comes from Rodney Mazinta, and his question is, will the outcome of the US elections bring about change in the Middle East if the Democrats win?
Yeah, I would say that the outcome certainly will bring about some change. I think that Trump has been a very pro-Israel president, but on the other side of the coin, Trump is very clear that he doesn't care about foreign wars or foreign countries much. And he's basically openly said to the current academy class at West Point, it's not America's job to fight in faraway places. So if there is a new president, there will be a slightly more hands-on American approach, but the overall trend is America is leaving the region. I think that Trump's approach was transactional, and that sometimes fuels conflicts, but it can also, I think people are afraid of Trump. The Iranians are very afraid of Trump. They think he's crazy. So I think that that meant that it did reduce it did deter Iran a bit. So there's a kind of bizarre double side to this. I think that Trump doesn't have a hands-on approach. He's transactional. He doesn't seem to care. However, people are afraid of him because they think he's a bit crazy. I think that when it comes to Joe Biden, a lot of people will test America's resolve. That can also cause a bit of chaos, but there is an expectation that America will be more stable, and that means there will not be maybe as many wars like Turkey is launching recently. In terms of Israel, Israel will expect a bit more criticism from a Biden administration, although Biden and his vice president are pro-Israel. And in terms of Iran, we will see a bit of a softening on the Iranian approach from the Biden administration. Maybe a tougher approach on Turkey. The Trump administration has appeased Turkey a lot. That's about it. I mean, the Middle East is the Middle East. I mean, it doesn't jump through American hoops. In general, it spends most of its time trying to do the opposite. So.
Thank you, Seth. I mean, I think depending on a Republican or Democrat win, I mean, we will see different scenarios being played out. I'm sure we'll all be watching those elections very closely. Esther Levitas, thank you for your question. Why has the world turned its back against the Kurds? Are they ever likely to have their own state?
I don't know if ever is a long time, but the Kurdish people were stabbed in the back and betrayed by the Europeans, and then later on during the Cold War by the Americans, and then later on helped by the Americans. Lots of countries like to use the Kurds, and I think the Kurds are a bit tired of that. I think that in the last several years, we've seen 300,000 Kurdish people ethnically cleansed from Afrin and other places by Turkey, and in some cases militias in Iraq. So it's difficult. The Kurds are a large minority group that happen to live in 4 different countries, and they happen to live in 2 of those countries are very powerful countries, Iran and Turkey. In Iraq and Syria, they have some autonomy, so they're very lucky in that respect. But this is a world that is profoundly unjust, because this world still lives inside the borders that European colonists created. And therefore, people who were not given a country in 1950 by the Europeans apparently can never have a country, which is a bit strange, because it's unclear to me why one man who drew a line on a map in 1960 gets to decide how people will live for the next 100 years. But unfortunately, lots of people have died trying to figure that out. And I think the Kurdish people are an example of people who have been imprisoned inside borders that were almost on the verge of being genocidal for a very long time. But actually, today, the Kurds in northern Iraq are doing very good. Northern Iraq is one of the more stable, nice areas in the Middle East. If when COVID is over, I suggest to everyone to fly to Erbil. It's a wonderful city, and the Kurdish region is a wonderful region. It's totally peaceful. It's relatively safe, although it's not entirely like every place. There is always some threat from Iran or something, but it's basically a nice area.
Thank you. The next 2 questions I'm going to kind of join together. So Zmira Cohen, thank you, and Karen Marsden, thank you for your questions. Seth, these questions read, do you think some responsible authority in the Western world is taking the infiltration by ISIS-type radicals into Mozambique seriously? The second question was, should we in South Africa be concerned with the threat of ISIS on our doorstep? And I might just add to that, how chilling, how concerning are these links between ISIS and Mozambique for those of us here in South Africa?
Yeah, I think that, you have to take this stuff very seriously. You cannot allow countries like Mozambique to melt away and be destabilized. The evidence is that once that happens, it creates a cycle and a process that gets worse. Insofar as South Africa probably has one of the strongest armies in Africa, certainly in that region, I would say that it behooves South Africa to take a forward approach and to be involved heavily, if it can, with the work, of course, with the support of the other regional states, if it can. I would think that South Africa and Zambia, Botswana, and these countries, even Namibia, those countries have an interest in stability, and they should project their stability beyond their region, which means creating a stronger bloc and a stronger defense forces agreements, and insofar as they can, working to destroy whatever areas are being taken over by these groups. That's very important, and I think that if it doesn't happen, you'll find that the fangs of these groups, they grow like a bit of an octopus combined with a snake. So South Africa should take a forward approach. I know that South Africa, probably because of the history, does not like, is reticent, I think, to do military adventures, and I would understand that. Of course, the government would be reticent to do that, and I can understand that wholeheartedly, but they should nevertheless think about it.
Thank you. The next question is from Stephen Groost, who's a reporter from the Jewish Report. So I'd actually like to unmute Stephen, please, so he can ask his question to Seth himself.
Hi, Seth. Thank you for a fascinating tour of the Middle East and what's going on. Do you really expect other countries to normalize relations with Israel as Trump and Bibi have been promising? Is it realistic, and what's the sort of time frame, or is that impossible to tell? Thanks.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, if I look at a list now of the countries that don't recognize Israel, I think it's like 30 countries or so. I could, no reason to read them all off, but some of them, we've heard rumors, obviously, Oman, Morocco, Qatar, Kuwait, Mauritania. We've heard some rumors. I think that you have to ask yourself, why is it all these countries don't have relations with Israel? They should all have relations with Israel. It's ridiculous that they don't. So is it realistic? Yes, I think it's realistic that if the Trump administration keeps pushing, or another U.S. administration is willing to push, then I would say it's possible, of course, that Oman could come to some thoughtful agreement. Of course, it has issues with Iran. Obviously, countries that are further away, why does Israel not have relations with Djibouti, apparently, or Mauritania, or the Maldives, or even Malaysia? I mean, those countries you would think would be obvious, perhaps, even Bangladesh, I think that, or Brunei, I mean, Indonesia, I would think that those are countries that Israel naturally should be working with, or could be working with. So there's no reason for them to be hostage to a kind of 1970s paradigm. And I think that once you begin to break down that paradigm, it's totally possible. I would think that Saudi Arabia and some of those countries would have to signal, of course, the support. And I think it's only possible, the countries so far that did it, they did it with a blessing of the King of Saudi Arabia. And that would mean countries that are not in that orbit, which is Malaysia, maybe closer, for instance, to Turkey, will therefore not do that. And so that is a big question mark. Who is controlling the country? Sudan, for instance, has moved from a pro-Turkey orbit to a pro-Saudi orbit. And a country like Sudan, it wants to be off the US terror list. It also needs investment. And you say to yourself, well, why would you not normalize relations with Israel? I mean, there's just no reason. And if someone could sell it to them on that and say, listen, once you're friends with Israel, then you can pressure them on the Palestinian question even more. Great. I mean, I don't see why not. It's possible, but it is a long journey, probably.
Thank you, Seth. You mentioned, made reference to Turkey in your answer there, which leads into another question, which is, how do you see the future of the relationship between Israel and Turkey?
Well, the relationship between Israel and Turkey is very bad. That's almost entirely due to the Turkish current leadership, which is very close to Hamas and has had a very, very hostile relationship since 2009 and 10, when Turkey claimed that it was betrayed by the invasion of Gaza by the former Israeli administration, and it also sent this Mavi Marmara humanitarian ship to Gaza, which no country would allow a ship to kind of enter its waters like that. And so Israel did the raid, 10 people were killed, and obviously that Turkey cannot forgive that, which is a bit understandable. But Turkey, as you can see, its current trend is more and more extreme. So until the leadership in Turkey will change, which like any country in the world, eventually it will change, it will be very difficult for these countries to ever work together again. It's unfortunate because Turkey and Israel have a lot in common in terms of trade, and they're both very modern states. They're ostensibly close to the West a bit. So it's unfortunate, but I think it will take maybe 20 years, and then maybe we see some change.
Back to ISIS, Seth, somebody's asking you, who is funding ISIS now?
I have no idea. I don't know about terror finance. So it's not a helpful question for me, but I would say that from what I know, in the old days, they were using kidnappings and stuff, even the trading of slaves for funding. I mean, they were really doing that, and it's very macabre, it's disgusting, but they were doing the worst possible things. And ISIS ISIS was a very wealthy state. I tell you, I was on the front line, and we didn't have any electricity where I was. We were in a ditch, looked like a First World War trench, and we had generator with some lights out front to see if guys were coming at us. But besides that, we didn't have much light at all. And the town that was occupied by ISIS down below, they had 24 hours a day of electricity. I mean, so how's that possible? So they had a lot of money. They say they still have money, but I mean, as I said, there's theft, there's kidnapping, there's ransoms. And I don't know if, you would say that I don't think that there's evidence now of state funding or things like that. But I'm not an expert on terror finance.
Okay, let's have a look at this next question here. This question says, what are the chances of the Saudis tactically announcing that they are willing to talk to Israel to find ways to resolve the Middle East impasse?
Who was it? Who was
the
that?
Saudis.
Oh, the Saudis, I think, it's possible. They have to, for them, it's a bit complicated because they pushed the Saudi initiative, which is this Arab initiative in 2000. So that means going back on it a bit. I think that means they need some concessions with the Palestinians, or they need the Palestinians on board, or they need a different leadership in Ramallah to give them the go ahead a bit. I don't think the current king, I can't imagine him sitting down probably with Israel, but it does appear if the crown prince and that group stays on, it would appear that they might consider it at some point. But I think the Saudis, they want to appear above it and a bit aloof and let all the other countries go first. And while of course signaling, yes, please do that. So they're playing a very complicated game.
Thank you. There's an interesting and important question here. Bev Price, thank you for your question. How does Israel position itself on the new war in Armenia?
Israel has very, very close relations with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan also has close relations with Turkey, which is very interesting. But the fact is that Azerbaijan for many years has been close to Israel, including a defense relationship. And that's public knowledge that Israel has sold them lots of drones and other things. So it's interesting because historically, the Jewish people and Armenian people have a lot in common. They're both historic victims of massacre and genocide. So it's interesting that Israel is close to Azerbaijan, but that is a realpolitik, pragmatic relationship. Israel has one of its most talented diplomats, a man named George Deek is the ambassador there, and Israel invests a lot in that relationship. It's important strategically relating to Iran and other reasons. Armenia obviously is close to Russia. Israel does not have a problem with Russia. I think Israel gets along fine with Russia, but Israel just does not see a lot of shared interests with Armenia. There's not much that Israel gets out of it. And Israel historically has gotten a lot out of having a good friend in the Caucasus that is a Muslim nation. And Israel tends to invest a lot in those relationships, historically with Turkey and with Senegal and some other Muslim countries that Israel has had good relations with in the past. So that's the reality of the conflict. I don't think that Israel has taken any official position on this conflict, and I would doubt to say that it would. I don't think it will. We will just have to see what comes out of this this conflict, and it would not be helpful for Israel if Turkey were to try to use this to leverage it to then do something against Israel, which I think Turkey would like to do that after this conflict, would then like to isolate Israel a bit.
Thank you. Another question about the recent deals. Are these normalization deals with the UAE and Bahrain? Would you say they are more strategic than peace related?
Well, it does look strategic because I would say that the current alliance system that Israel is joining is an alliance system that consists of the UAE, Bahrain, in a sense, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, a bit Jordan, and then Greece and Cyprus. This is an arc, an alliance arc. And if you want to look at a First World War comparison, you could say that this looks like, the Triple Entente or whatever. And the other side of the coin is obviously Iran and Turkey and their allies, which are like the Central Powers or whatever. So this is an alliance system. That's pragmatic. That's true. But, I think when I look at the Zoom conversations, which are happening with the UAE, I see a lot of warmth, and I see, Israelis are very, very hopeful, and Israelis sometimes, you could say, despite reputation as being kind of tough, they're also a bit naive in terms of the fact that, well, great, people should like us. Why don't people like us? And so Israelis, I think, are super happy about it. But the problem is, the question is, okay, is it more than skin deep in the UAE? I mean, the average people in the UAE, by the way, are mostly foreign workers. So they don't really care about Israel. I mean, they probably like Israel. Filipino foreign workers in the UAE don't have any problem with Israel. So the question is, is there an Emirati population that does oppose this? And probably there may be, but we don't hear their voices. But from what I've seen, it looks like we could have what's the line at the end of Casablanca, you know, the start of a beautiful friendship or something? I would hope that that's the case, but we've seen these, you know, Israelis have gone through this sadness before in the 90s of being like, oh, peace is going to happen. And then people find out it doesn't. So we'll see. We'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, thank you for that, Seth. There was an article in the Mail and Guardian yesterday that framed incredibly negatively about the recent deals. I think for many of us, we would view them as a sort of a watershed moment in the history of the region, something incredibly positive and something worth rejoicing in. This article made reference to this being nothing more than the Trump administration muscling states into embracing Israel, and it's all about economic exploitation and political blackmail. And I wonder if you could perhaps respond to those accusations.
Well, again, I would say it's you know, it's a ridiculous notion that Israel doesn't have relations with these countries. I mean, there's no other case in the world. There's no other country in the world that is people try to diplomatically isolate a country like the way they do Israel. People say, yeah, but Israel's occupying. Yeah, okay, well, good. Lots of countries occupy. That's awful. It's bad. But you should have relations with Israel. Then you can get them to stop occupying if that's your problem. How is it that 60 years of not having relations got Israel to stop its apparent bad behavior? It didn't work. So maybe try something else. I don't think it's a total nonsensical idea that Israel should not have relations. It should have relations with every country, and then all those countries can join together and pressure Israel to do things. So it just doesn't make sense. The idea somehow that it's bad or it's exploitation. I mean, so then ask yourself, every country in the world has relations with the UAE. How is it possible that it's fine for Zambia to have relations with the UAE, but we don't want Israel? It doesn't make sense. If you don't like the UAE, then you're welcome to not have relations with it. Israel's fine. Israel would like to do that. So the idea that the UAE is some sort of, suddenly people decided that the UAE is an authoritarian country. The UAE has been the same style of monarchy since the British left. So it didn't change. So the idea that suddenly people woke up and they didn't like the UAE, it doesn't make sense. And if the countries are the same countries, it's the same sun every day. And therefore, I think I would say that if you are not of the opinion that the UAE should break off relations with Pakistan or India because of Kashmir, or you're not of the theory that people should break off relations with Turkey because of the occupation of northern Cyprus or something, then I would say that, okay, so then you should be of the opinion that Israel should have relations, and then you will use the relations to pressure Israel. And that probably would be I would think would be much more effective. I think generally people that are friends listens to each other more than if someone says, well, I just hate you. You're like, okay, then I won't listen to you. So be friends with Israel and then get Israel to do things for you. And I would assume that would be, that would work better.
Thank you, Seth. That was a fantastic answer. Thank you. So I think we have time for 2 more questions. I'd like to ask if we could please unmute David Lazarus. And David, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thanks, Galia. Seth, you'd mentioned, for instance, that Sudan was originally pro-Muslim, and now it's changed. Don't you think that with Israel's experience, its intelligence in dealing with Muslim extremism, it could persuade countries like Nigeria, who have Al-Shabaab, and Mozambique, who've now got ISIS, to improve relations with it in what you call a transactional basis, to actually combat that radical extremism through its own influence, and obviously by assisting with perhaps armaments and whatever, certainly intelligence.
It's complicated. I mean, look, I don't know. These countries, you know, the idea that a country that's very, very poor, like these countries tend to be in the global south, the idea that they would be able to afford Israeli weaponry is not really realistic, because I was at a drone factory recently where they showed you a relatively small drone. They said, well, how much is that? Well, it's $500,000 for the drone. Even Israeli police cannot afford the drone that Israel makes. So I would say that, you know, the idea that Mozambique could be revolutionized in its armed forces. Now, intelligence sharing, yes. I don't know how good Israel's intelligence is in that part of Africa. I would assume that the British, who have historic intelligence and pride themselves in such things, would like to be involved, or South Africa. Or South Africa has a very good intelligence service, I think, historically. So I don't know what good Israel would do there. I mean, in terms of Sudan, yeah, it's a much closer country to Israel. Israel, by the way, has some relations with Sudan in the past. Israel rescued the Ethiopian community through Sudan. My wife was one of the people that was rescued. So Israel has been to Sudan. Israel knows a lot about Sudan. You know, and Sudan, as you said, it was once a Muslim Brotherhood government, was a bit extremist, but Sudan is a very diverse country. There's no reason that Sudan could not be working with Israel. But I'm not sure. As I said, I've been to Senegal, where Israel has very good relations. It's not entirely clear what trade relations there are with a place like Senegal, though. They don't necessarily fit together. A country like Senegal probably has much more to gain from its former colonial power like France, in terms of some infrastructure projects and things. Israel does drip irrigation and things like that. I mean, in terms of intelligence and weapons, as I said, yeah, some intelligence sharing would be great. I think, again, the Saudis probably have great intelligence there as well. So I'm not sure what great added benefit Israel could do. Maybe it could help with a bit of surveillance or something. I'm not sure how much of a game changer it would be. Israel's just a super high-tech country, and some countries don't need that. Azerbaijan is an example of a country that did acquire a lot of Israeli drones. I think has used them very effectively. But as you can see, it's not winning the war in some sort of blitzkrieg. So, you know, even that, it's not entirely clear. If you just buy one part of the system, but you don't buy the rest of the Israeli system or Western style military system, I'm not sure you win wars like that. You win parts of the war.
Thank you, Seth. And so we'll have our final question now. And if we could please unmute Chris Eden.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Seth, for a very interesting discussion. I have really a two-part question. One is, we have Iran and Turkey on the move, both expansionist. At what point do they actually start to clash with each other? And then the second part of it is, as the Arab states start to gain an interest in Israel, Israel's stability becomes important. And wouldn't that count more in favor of Israel in negotiation with the Palestinians than it would create a pressure on Israel? Because the Palestinian demands potentially weaken Israel if they stick to the territorial demands that they have. That potentially will weaken Israel going forward. So the Arab states have an interest in Israel's security going forward. Thank you.
So in terms of Iran and Turkey, I am of the opinion that Iran and Turkey are trending to be allies and not trending to fight each other. I know that there is a lot of consensus that believes that because Turkey is a Sunni country and Iran is Shiite, and because Turkey is the inheritor of the Ottoman Empire and the Iranians are Persians, they are therefore destined to clash. I would say that the political Islamic group that runs the country, which is the IRGC Khomeinists in Tehran and the Muslim Brotherhood in Ankara, those people actually have a very similar worldview when it comes to certain issues like Israel and quote unquote liberating Al-Aqsa. I would say that actually political Islam has a lot more in common than what is those certain ancient issues. And this, I believe there's partly a myth, the idea that Shiites and Sunnis are always going to clash. I mean, they've been around for 1,500 years, right? They didn't all slaughter each other. So I don't think that's true. I think that they have certain interests. And I think that Turkey and Iran might work together with Russia and China in the future. And we will have to see then, you know, how they do this dance. I've compared it to a pre-World War I example. So it's not entirely clear. We don't know where exactly that leads, but I think that's kind of where we are a bit. And, you know, sometimes countries work with each other, even if they don't seem to actually have much in common. Now, into the second part of the question. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I'm not even sure if I should elaborate on it much, because you've made a point that I didn't even think that much about and didn't make, which is that actually, yes, the more that these countries have relations with Israel, the less they may care about the Palestinian issue, because yes, they will prefer the Israeli relationship. And the idea that a kind of chaotic Palestinian polity in the West Bank and Gaza is preferable to the powerhouse that is Tel Aviv's high-tech sector would be right. Why would you prefer that? I mean, it's like the Gulf states. No one says that they should democratize, because everyone probably understands that, well, democracy could create chaos there. And so I think that yeah, that's a strange devil's agreement, and I think that that is a good point. It's not entirely clear. You know, Egypt is close to Israel because they both don't like Hamas, and Egypt has believed in the past that Hamas contributed to the insurgency in Sinai, and you know, Egypt would much prefer stability. So that's true. They would have an interest in that, and less of an interest in creating a Palestinian state. However, I've argued in the Daily Beast that we're not going to have a Palestinian state probably for a long time. We will have what is called the 1.5 state solution. 1.5, which is one is Israel, and the Palestinians will not become a state. They will become an autonomous region, similar to the Kurdistan region or similar to other sub-state regions all over the world, whether Northern Cyprus or Abkhazia or Transnistria, or other types of autonomous areas, or areas that are a country but doesn't fully have their own foreign policy, like Lesotho, which is obviously in your neighborhood. So a smaller area that it functions as a country but not fully, doesn't control its own borders. And I tend to think that that's where we're going. And I think the Palestinians will get close to statehood. And I do not believe that they will become a kind of state that we think of as a traditional state. But that does not mean that they cannot achieve a lot of what they want, which is lots of areas like Somaliland, which is considered not a country, behaves like a country. The Kurdistan region behaves like a country, and Northern Cyprus behaves like a country, and Kosovo, which half the world doesn't recognize, behaves like a country. And that's where I think the Palestinians will go. And that's my prediction and my prophecy.
That's great, thank you. I think this has actually been really a tremendous Q&A session. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope all of you have as well. So thanks to all of you who posted such good questions. And Seth, thank you so much for engaging with us and answering our questions and really sort of unpacking these different issues and themes and helping us to understand the region better. We really do appreciate your time, and thank you for that. What I would like to do now is hand over to Rodney Mazinter. As I'm sure you all know, Rodney is our Vice Chair of the Zionist Federation here in Cape Town and the Chair of our Media Committee. And Rodney would just like to say a word of thanks in closing. Sorry, Rodney, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, there we go. I got so excited that I forgot to do that. What I was saying, Seth, is that I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everybody who had the pleasure and privilege of listening to you, that your depth and expanse of your knowledge has been most impressive. As a writer and a journalist, you've built over the years an enviable reputation as a no-nonsense, courageous seeker after the truth. The reason you have audiences hanging on your every word has a lot more to do than with your undoubted eloquence and abiding willingness to seek the truth at the coalface of international events, but more importantly, your courage in your search of the facts, the fact that you are prepared to go right into where it's all happening and bring away with you this understanding of the situation we face. As a participant in our online programming, you recognized as being a first-hand witness to the fact that anti-Israel and, dare I say it, anti-Semitic activity has not diminished during the time of crisis. On the contrary, it is still there. We didn't ask you to deal with anti-Semitism, so I'm not going further, but this is all despite the recent signing of the peace accords between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. The South African Zionist Federation has invested significant resources and energy into providing online programming to continue informing and educating our followers and the public about the dangers, and let us not ignore the opportunities we all face. You've not disappointed us in this aim. Your professional life has been spent at the coalface, as I've said, of current events in the Middle East, and long may it continue as the voice of reason and understanding. And thank you for sharing your insights and wisdom with us. We wish you well, and we hope that we'll be able to hear from you further on this subject in the future. While I'm at it, Galia, just hold the line a moment. It would be remiss of me if I didn't thank others who were involved in this webinar this evening. And I'm talking about the professional staff at the South African Zionist Federation, and also those volunteers who were directly involved in setting this all up. And I'm talking about Julie Berman, Galia, who we've seen handle the questions here, Yvette, Natasha, Maxine, David, of course, who steered us through this all, and Linda Peretz. I thank you all, and I hope that we will see the audience, the really fine audience that we've had here this evening at future webinars, which I hope to bring you. Thank you again, Seth.
Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Galia. I'm sure you'll agree that was a fantastic webinar. Before we go, I'm just going to take 2 seconds of your time to tell you about some upcoming events. On the 27th of October, we have a webinar on employment in Israel with a Q&A with Michael Merton, career consultant, that's brought to you in collaboration with Telfed and the Israel Center. And, the South African Zionist Federation Cape Council Virtual Biennial Conference takes place on Sunday, the 8th of November at 4 p.m. Watch your inbox and social media for more information about the great lineup of speakers and registration details. And with that, I thank you all, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next one. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.